In the hidden corners of jazz history, some stories are whispered, never written. Pat Martino and George Benson, two guitar giants whose paths intertwined in ways few truly understand, once shared a bond that seemed unshakable. But long after the applause faded and the lights dimmed, Martino would speak of truths that challenged the image of their friendship. In his final days, with nothing left to lose, he revealed a side of their story that would make fans question everything. What happened between these two masters of the guitar that was never meant to be heard? In the 1960s, the jazz world was alive with possibility. The electric guitar, still a relatively new voice in the genre, was being shaped by a handful of innovators, each with their own style, their own way of bending notes into poetry. Among them were two young men who seemed destined for greatness, Pat Martino and George Benson. Pat Martino, born Patrick Carmen Azara in 1944 in Philadelphia, was a prodigy before he even knew the meaning of the word. By his late teens, he had already earned a reputation as a formidable player, with a clean, lightning-fast style and a deep, almost philosophical connection to his instrument. The guitar was not just a tool for him, it was an extension of his mind. George Benson, born in 1943 in Pittsburgh, was cut from a different cloth. Smooth, charismatic, and effortlessly melodic, Benson blended jazz chops with a soulful, pop-friendly sensibility. His voice, both literal and through the guitar, was honeyed, inviting, commercial, without sacrificing artistry. Their early careers moved in parallel. Each was carving out a place in a competitive scene, performing with jazz greats, earning respect from both peers and audiences. It was only a matter of time before their paths crossed, and when they did, the result was electric. In smoky clubs and late-night jam sessions, Martino and Benson found in each other a rare challenge. Here were two men of equal technical mastery, but with completely different approaches. Martino played with surgical precision and a cerebral edge. Benson flowed with a natural ease that seemed almost effortless. On stage, it was less a competition than a conversation. Two dialects of the same language, trading phrases, pushing each other to new heights. To the audiences who witnessed those early encounters, it felt like they were watching the beginning of a lifelong partnership. The mutual respect between them was obvious. Martino often spoke highly of Benson in interviews, praising his fluidity and instinct. Benson, in turn, called Martino one of the purest guitarists alive. But beneath the notes and applause, the seeds of tension were already quietly being planted. It was 1967 when Pat Martino and George Benson first officially shared a stage, on a night that would become legendary in jazz circles. The venue was small, a dimly lit club in New York, where the air was thick with cigarette smoke and anticipation. Word had spread that Benson, fresh from his work with organist Jack McDuff, was in the city, and Martino, already making waves with his solo albums, was also in town. The promoter, sensing a rare opportunity, booked them together for a one-night set. There was no rehearsal, no set list, just two guitars, a rhythm section, and the unspoken understanding that something extraordinary might happen. When they took the stage, the room fell silent. The first tune began tentatively, each man feeling out the other's phrasing, like two master chess players testing their opponent's opening moves. Then, as if some invisible signal had been given, they both opened up. The music turned into a storm, Martino's rapid-fire runs cutting through Benson's velvet-smooth chords, Benson's melodic lines answering with equal force. The audience, packed shoulder to shoulder, watched in awe. It wasn't just skill on display, it was two visions of the guitar colliding and merging into something entirely new. By the final tune, people were on their feet, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Backstage, the atmosphere was warm. Martino congratulated Benson on his phrasing. Benson praised Martino's precision. There was talk of doing it again, of maybe even recording something together. In those early moments, there was nothing but mutual admiration. Yet, in a world as small and competitive as jazz, admiration can quickly give way to something more complicated. Martino was fiercely devoted to the purity of his art, avoiding the pull of commercial trends. Benson, though deeply rooted in jazz, had an ear for crossover success, for music that could reach beyond the small club and into the mainstream. That night, neither man knew that these differences would one day define and divide their relationship. In the years that followed their first shared gig, Martino and Benson's paths crossed often. Sometimes they played together. Other times they found themselves on the same festival bills, their sets scheduled back to back. In those days, there was a sense of camaraderie between them, a brotherhood forged in the shared struggle of life on the road. They would often linger after shows, guitars in hand, swapping licks and stories until the small hours of the morning. Musicians who were present at these sessions recall the intensity of their exchanges, how they would push each other into uncharted territory, laughing when one of them pulled off a particularly daring phrase. For Martino, Benson represented a kind of effortless mastery that he both admired and mistrusted. He respected Benson's ability to connect instantly with audiences, but he also feared that the pursuit of popularity could dilute the essence of jazz. Benson, for his part, saw Martino as a purist, perhaps too much so, a man whose devotion to the art sometimes came at the expense of broader recognition. Despite these differences, they maintained a bond. When Martino suffered a near-fatal brain aneurysm in 1980, Benson was among those who reached out, offering both financial and moral support during his long and grueling recovery. It was a gesture that Martino would never forget. But as the 1980s gave way to the 90s, their careers moved in starkly different directions. Benson achieved massive commercial success, scoring pop hits, and enjoying a level of fame few jazz guitarists ever reached. Martino, after relearning the guitar from scratch due to his illness, returned to the stage with renewed passion, but remained firmly within the jazz world, uninterested in chasing crossover appeal. It was during this period that small cracks began to form in their relationship. In interviews, Martino started to hint at a philosophical divide between himself and Benson. Comments subtle enough to be missed by casual fans, but noticed by those in the jazz community. And as the years went on, those cracks would widen, leading to revelations in Martino's final years that would forever change how their friendship was remembered. By the early 1990s, George Benson had become a household name far beyond the world of jazz purists. His velvety vocals and crossover hits like "Give Me the Night and Turn Your Love Around" had propelled him into the realm of pop superstardom. He was selling out arenas, appearing on television specials, and winning Grammys in categories that had little to do with straight-ahead jazz. Pat Martino, meanwhile, had taken a very different road back into the public eye. After his near-fatal brain aneurysm in 1980, he had been forced to relearn the guitar entirely, retraining his muscle memory from zero, like a child learning to walk. That comeback, marked by the release of albums like The Return and Interchange, cemented him as one of jazz's most resilient figures. But Martino's audience was still rooted in the small clubs and festival circuits, his reputation secure among the devoted but largely invisible to the mainstream. Beneath this contrast in careers was an unspoken tension, one that only began to surface in the conversations musicians had when no journalists were listening. In green rooms and after-hours jam sessions, Martino would sometimes share his thoughts on what he saw as a widening gap between artistic integrity and commercial appeal in jazz. He never mentioned Benson's name directly in these early years, but the implication hung in the air. Other musicians noticed the shift. Pat loved George, but he also felt, let's just say, conflicted about where George was headed. One guitarist who toured with both men later recalled, "He respected the talent, but he didn't always respect the choices." The jazz world itself was undergoing changes. Labels were signing fewer straight-ahead jazz acts, preferring the safer commercial returns of smooth jazz and crossover styles. For Martino, this was more than a trend. It was a symptom of what he believed was the industry's willingness to water down the art form to reach a broader audience. In this climate, Benson became both a symbol of success and, to some, a lightning rod for criticism. His concerts were polished, dazzling affairs, but for those who prized improvisation above all else, they sometimes felt too scripted, too calculated. Martino, who built his career on raw, in-the-moment creation, saw this difference not just as a stylistic choice, but as a philosophical one. The whispers grew louder after a particular jazz festival in the mid-90s, when Martino and Benson appeared on the same bill. Backstage, in the hours before Benson's headlining set, Martino was overheard telling a fellow musician that jazz was being dressed up for dinner parties and losing its edge. Though Benson's name wasn't spoken, those present believed the comment was aimed squarely in his direction. Still, the two men remained publicly cordial. In interviews, they spoke respectfully of each other, never airing grievances outright. But within the community, musicians began to notice how rarely they shared a stage anymore. It was as if both men knew that whatever bond they had once shared was shifting into something more complicated, something that would eventually demand a reckoning. In 2002, an unassuming festival gig in Europe would become the turning point in the Martino-Benson relationship. The event, held in a historic concert hall in the Netherlands, was billed as a celebration of the guitar in jazz, with an all-star lineup that included both men. It was the first time in years that they would share the stage, and anticipation ran high. The format was simple. Each guitarist would perform their own set, followed by a collaborative finale. Martino went first. His performance was electrifying, intricate, cerebral, and brimming with the fearless improvisation that had defined his career. The crowd responded with rapt attention, erupting into applause after every solo. Then came Benson's set. From the moment he walked on stage, the energy shifted. He charmed the audience instantly, telling stories between songs, singing smooth ballads, and weaving pop-infused guitar lines into familiar jazz standards. The crowd loved it, but in a different way, more like a celebration than a meditation. The final jam brought both men together for the first time that night. At first, it was magic. Two masters trading lines, building on each other's phrases. But about halfway through, something changed. Martino began pushing the harmony in unexpected directions, adding angular, complex chord substitutions that forced Benson into unfamiliar territory. Benson, known for his flawless fluidity, responded with showmanship, smiling at the audience and throwing in crowd-pleasing licks rather than matching Martino's harmonic daring. For the audience, it was thrilling, a kind of musical tug-of-war. But backstage, it was a different story. Witnesses recall Benson complimenting Martino on his playing, only for Martino to offer a tight-lipped nod. Later that night, Martino was overheard telling a fellow musician, "We weren't even playing the same song anymore." That gig became a quiet but definitive breaking point. Though they would both downplay any talk of rivalry in public, the philosophical divide between them had now been made visible for all to see. For Martino, it was confirmation that Benson had fully embraced an entertainment-first approach, something Martino saw as incompatible with the spirit of jazz improvisation. For Benson, it was likely a reminder that not every musician valued the same connection with the audience that he did. They would rarely perform together again after that night. After the Netherlands festival, the Martino-Benson relationship slipped quietly into estrangement. There was no public feud, no fiery exchange in the press, just an absence. They continued to move in the same circles, appearing on the same festival posters from time to time, but never sharing the stage. Both men were busy in their own ways. Benson continued to tour internationally, balancing his smooth jazz and pop repertoire with occasional nods to his bebop roots. Martino, always the road warrior, played clubs, theaters, and festivals, releasing critically acclaimed albums like Think Tank and Formidable. But among those who knew them personally, the distance was obvious. Mutual friends would sometimes suggest collaborations, only to be met with vague deflections from both sides. The warmth that had once marked their early friendship was gone, replaced by a polite but palpable coolness. Ego likely played a role, though not in the tabloid sense. In the insular world of jazz guitar, where respect is earned in the heat of live performance, each man had carved his own empire. Benson's was broad and commercially rich. Martino's was deep and artistically uncompromising. Neither needed the other to validate his path, but each knew that the other represented a choice he had deliberately not made. By the 2010s, the gulf between them had become as much about perception as reality. To Benson's fans, Martino was a jazz intellectual, brilliant but perhaps too rigid for mass appeal. To Martino's devotees, Benson was a sellout, an artist who had traded depth for dollars. The truth, as always, was more complex. In interviews, Martino began to speak more openly about his views on the industry, lamenting the loss of spaces for pure improvisation. Though he never named Benson directly, listeners could read between the lines. For his part, Benson continued to praise Martino's skill when asked, but he never sought to rekindle their bond. What neither man could have known was that time was running out for one of them, and that when the truth finally came out, it would not come from a place of anger, but of clarity. By the spring of 2018, Pat Martino had already outlived more than a few of his contemporaries. He had stared down a brain aneurysm that left him without a single memory of how to play guitar, clawed his way back from complete amnesia of his craft, and returned to the stage with an intensity that made his comeback legendary. But now, the years were catching up with him. He could feel it in the subtle ways his body resisted the road. The long-haul flights left his joints stiff for days. The load-ins, the sound checks, the endless string of hotels, it all weighed heavier than it once had. Still, Martino was not a man who gave in easily. His life had been defined by pushing against limits, and the idea of stopping felt foreign, even dangerous. That year's European and American tour was booked months in advance, and the promoters billed it as a celebration of Martino's 50-plus years in music. Each show was a pilgrimage for fans. In small jazz clubs in Rome, Paris, and Berlin, people packed in shoulder to shoulder, hoping to hear the same crystalline precision that had defined his career. And they weren't disappointed, at least not in the way they expected. Martino's playing was still exacting, still shaped with the care of a craftsman who had spent decades refining every nuance. But there were moments, fleeting but noticeable, when his concentration seemed to falter, when he leaned on the rhythm section to carry the momentum of a piece. The long solos of his youth had shortened. The space between notes felt heavier, almost contemplative. After one set in Rome, he was approached backstage by an old acquaintance from the early days of the New York jazz scene. They embraced warmly, two survivors of a vanished era. Over wine and quiet laughter, they traded stories, nights on the road, gigs that went wrong, the friends they'd lost. Eventually, the conversation turned to George Benson. The smile that crossed Martino's face was slow and faint, tinged with something unnameable. "George and I," he said, "walked the same road for a while, but we were always heading toward different destinations." The acquaintance, sensing an opening, asked what he meant. Martino's eyes narrowed slightly, his tone measured. We understood each other musically, but personally, philosophically, I'm not sure we ever truly did. He left it at that, but those few sentences carried the weight of decades. There was admiration there, but also something else, a residue of disappointment, perhaps even hurt. By the end of the tour, Martino had made a quiet decision. He didn't announce a retirement, he simply stopped booking shows. To his fans, it seemed like a pause between projects. To those who knew him best, it was the first sign that his time in the spotlight was drawing to a close. The silence that followed would prove temporary. He would speak again, but not on stage, and not in the way anyone expected. The next time his voice reached the public, it would not be through the strings of his guitar, but through words that had been building inside him for years. Words about George Benson. Words that would shift the way their history was understood. The living room was dim, lit only by a pair of soft lamps and the faint winter light filtering through the blinds. The year was 2019, and Pat Martino sat in his Philadelphia home, guitar within arm's reach, though it would remain untouched that day. His voice was calm, measured, and almost startling in its fragility. A small film crew had been invited to record an interview for an independent documentary on the history of jazz guitar. It was not intended as an exposé nor a platform for personal grievances. It was meant to be a reflective piece, capturing the thoughts of a man whose life had spanned the extremes of human endurance and artistic achievement. Martino was careful at first. The questions covered familiar ground: his early years in South Philadelphia, the long nights learning to play by ear, the clubs where the smoke hung so thick you could taste it, the tour buses that rattled their way through the industrial heart of America. He spoke of his mentors, his near-death experience, the painstaking relearning of every chord and scale after the aneurysm that erased his memory. It was almost routine. Then the interviewer shifted in his seat, flipping a page in his notes. "You came up alongside some remarkable guitarists," he said cautiously. "Players like Wes Montgomery, Tal Farlow, and George Benson." There was a pause, a very long pause. Martino didn't look at the interviewer. His gaze drifted toward the guitar in the corner, the familiar curve of its body catching the lamplight. He chuckled, not the laugh of a man amused, but of someone recalling something bittersweet. "George," Martino began, the single syllable carrying a lifetime. "George is George." It could have ended there, an artfully vague answer that satisfied the question without revealing a thing. But something in the quiet that followed seemed to pull at Martino. He shifted forward in his chair. "You have to understand," he said slowly. "When we were young, we were equals, not in fame, not in record sales, but in hunger. We both lived for the guitar. We pushed each other. We kept each other sharp. But over time, George made choices. Choices that brought him wealth, comfort, a global audience. I can't fault him for that. Everybody's got to live. But it came with a price." The cameraman barely moved, afraid to break the spell. "Jazz," Martino continued, "real jazz is risk. It's danger. It's walking a tightrope with no net. And at some point, George decided he preferred a stage with guardrails. That's not wrong. It's just not the road I chose." He let the words hang there. The room was still, save for the faint hum of the recording equipment. "I don't say this to hurt him," Martino added after a moment. "I say it because it's the truth, as I see it. George could have been the greatest jazz guitarist in history, not just commercially, but artistically. Instead, he became the most famous. There's a difference." His voice was neither angry nor bitter. If anything, it was tired. These were not the jabs of a rival trying to tear someone down. They were the reflections of a man who had spent decades thinking about the diverging paths of two prodigies. The filmmakers didn't press further. They knew they'd just captured something rare, a moment of unvarnished honesty from a notoriously private figure. When the interview wrapped, Martino shook their hands warmly, even thanked them for letting him put a few things out there. He couldn't have known that those words would take on a life of their own after his death. But somewhere in the back of his mind, perhaps he suspected. By late 2021, the light in Pat Martino's home had taken on a quieter tone. The instruments still stood where they always had, lined against the wall like sentinels, but the sound of practice sessions, the daily ritual of warming up his hands and mind, had grown rare. He was not bedridden, but his health had been in steady decline. Breathing felt like work. Even speaking required measured effort. Friends noticed the changes when they visited. He greeted them with the same warm eyes, the same deliberate grace. But the energy that once radiated from him had dimmed. Still, he was lucid, sharp in conversation, and often surprisingly light-hearted, especially when talk turned to music. It was during one of these visits, just weeks before his death, that the conversation returned, inevitably, to George Benson. This time, there was no camera, no documentary crew, just Martino, an old musician friend from the Philadelphia days, and a pot of tea between them. "You know," his friend began, "people are still talking about what you said in that interview." Martino smiled faintly. "I figured they might." "They're calling it controversial," the friend continued. "Some are even saying you were taking shots at George." Martino shook his head. "I wasn't taking shots. I was telling the truth. There's a difference." He leaned back, letting his eyes wander to the guitar on the stand by the window. The late afternoon sun spilled over its strings, each one catching the light like a silver thread. "When I think about George," Martino said slowly, "I think about the first time we played together. We were kids, barely out of our teens. There was no fame, no money, no business, just the music. That night I thought, here's someone who gets it, who understands the risk, the hunger. But as the years went on, I realized we were playing different games. I was chasing mastery. He was chasing immortality." The friend raised an eyebrow. "And you think he found it?" "Oh, he found something," Martino replied. "He found a way to be everywhere at once, on the radio, on television, in every record store in the country. That's a kind of immortality, sure. But I think the price was leaving something behind. A piece of the fire. Once you trade that for comfort, it doesn't come back." Martino's voice trailed off, as if he were weighing whether to continue. Then, with a sigh, he leaned forward. "Here's what people don't know," he said. "In the early 70s, before he really broke through, George and I had a talk. He said to me, 'Pat, there's only so far you can go with jazz. If you want to make a living, you have to cross over.' I told him, 'Maybe, but if you cross over too far, you can't cross back.' We never saw eye to eye on that, and maybe that's why we drifted." The friend listened silently. Martino's words were not laced with resentment, but with a deep, almost paternal sadness, as though watching someone take a path that led to both triumph and loss. "I respect George," Martino continued. "I always have. But I can't pretend we wanted the same thing. And I think people should know that. Not to divide us, but to understand us." The room was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the city went about its evening routines, unaware of the weight of the conversation happening in that small apartment. When the friend finally left, Martino walked him to the door. His steps were slow, deliberate. They hugged, and Martino said something he rarely said. "If you tell anyone about this talk, make sure you get it right." 3 weeks later, Pat Martino was gone. Those final words to his friend, and the recorded interview from 2019, would be the last time the world heard his unfiltered thoughts on George Benson. In them was no malice, no grudge, just a truth he had carried quietly for decades. And yet, once they reached the public, truth would prove to be the most dangerous legacy of all. When news of Pat Martino's death broke on November 1, 2021, the jazz world seemed to exhale all at once. An exhale heavy with grief, but also with awe for what he had survived, achieved, and given. Social media feeds filled with tributes from guitarists across generations, from young conservatory students to seasoned legends. They spoke of his tone, his precision, his refusal to compromise. But quietly, in certain corners of the community, another conversation was beginning to stir. That conversation centered on the 2019 interview and the private recollections from those who had known Martino in his final years. In those words lay a narrative far more complicated than the clean, reverent eulogies filling the headlines. Some called it a reckoning, others a misunderstanding. The comments about George Benson, carefully spoken but unmistakable in their meaning, were now resurfacing. Jazz forums lit up with debates that ranged from respectful analysis to heated argument. Was Martino's reflection an honest critique, born of love for the art form? Or was it a subtle condemnation of a peer who had chosen a different road to success? To some, Benson's career was the very embodiment of versatility and survival, a man who had found a way to keep jazz guitar relevant in an era that seemed determined to bury it. To others, he represented a cautionary tale of what happens when commercial success pulls an artist away from the dangerous, uncharted territory that defines the genre. And Martino, in death, became the symbol of the opposite choice, the artist who never wavered, even if it meant walking a lonelier, less profitable path. Music journalists began revisiting old footage of the two men, searching for clues. There was that grainy black-and-white clip from a club in the late 60s, where Martino and Benson traded solos with unspoken competitiveness, each pushing the other harder, faster, deeper. There were photographs from festival lineups in the 70s, where they stood side by side, smiling for the cameras but, some claimed, smiling with different motives. Even their discographies told diverging stories. Benson's catalog was a tapestry of styles: soul jazz, smooth jazz, R&B, even pop hits that topped the Billboard charts. Martino's was a more focused, sometimes austere body of work, deeply rooted in bebop, modal jazz, and the intricate interplay of small ensembles. Yet for all their differences, the two names were now bound together in the public's mind more tightly than they had been in decades. In Philadelphia, a memorial concert for Martino drew an impressive roster of jazz heavyweights. Midway through the evening, a surprise guest walked on stage, George Benson himself. The room held its breath. Benson did not address the interview. He did not offer rebuttals or defenses. Instead, he spoke simply of their shared history, the nights in smoky clubs, the countless conversations about music and life. Pat, he said, was a brother. Even when we disagreed, we learned from each other. Then, picking up a guitar, Benson played a slow, aching ballad. No vocals, just the unbroken line of his melody filling the hall. Some swore it was a tribute. Others wondered if it was an answer. The performance ended without flourish. Benson left the stage quietly, as if to say the rest was between them. In the weeks that followed, the noise around Martino's comments gradually faded. But the questions they raised lingered, like the final chord of a song that refuses to resolve. What does an artist owe to their audience? To their art? To themselves? Can you chase greatness and comfort at the same time? Or does one inevitably slip away? For Pat Martino, the choice had been clear, even costly. For George Benson, the answer had been different, but no less deliberate. Two roads, two legacies, and between them, a story that would continue to haunt the quiet spaces of jazz history, long after both men had played their final note. In the end, Pat Martino and George Benson weren't just two guitarists, they were two visions of what a life in music could be. One chose the razor's edge of pure artistry, the other, the boundless reach of global fame. Which path would you have taken? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story moved you, subscribe for more untold truths from the hidden corners of music history.